You know, in Doctor Who, when you get to the end of the series and you know there's a new Doctor actor going to be for the next series, the last one of the previous series, they have to do something, don't they?
Yes.
And I'm conscious that we've lost Richard this week, who's having a day off, and we've got another Richard. So it feels like we're having this.
Yes, I'm the substitute Richard.
You're the new Doctor.
Yeah, I hope I don't disappoint.
Transition. You do all the same banter and all the same jokes as he does.
Yes, I've been watching him very closely in previous podcasts.
Also, I've got to give you bad news. Normally, we start one of these podcasts with some alcohol-free beer. And if you've been listening to some recently, you'll know we've been making quite a round of the various offerings from the alcohol-free beer shop down in the Wild Cop. Dry, yeah. And we've got some great stuff in there.
Yeah, I've had some.
But I just thought a bit early in the morning. I was tempted to get the Guinness Zero out of the fridge, but I thought a bit early in the morning, we'll just have a coffee instead.
I've tried their red wine.
How would you think of that? Not as good as the real red wine.
The trouble was, I was having dinner with people drinking real wine.
Okay.
And I had a glass.
Yeah.
And then I had to go back to the
proper stuff.
Alcohol-free red.
Oh, I see. You had a glass of
that was a bad move.
You just stick to the alcohol-free all the way through.
Don't have a glass of Shiraz halfway through.
Oh, well, that's a pretty peppery, strong...
Yeah, make your decision and stick to it.
Stick to it.
Yeah.
Good tip. Top tips on drinking from Wellmeadow.
Yeah.
All right, well, I guess we better start a podcast. Cue the music. Hello and welcome again to the SME Growth Podcast. I'm Dave Parry from Wellmeadow Limited. And today we've got an interesting subject with a guest that we're going to talk about. And it's all aimed at addressing the challenges that businesses are facing at the moment in trying to recruit high quality, high caliber people into their companies at a time when we've got a lot of vacancies in the country. So I'm very delighted to welcome with us Richard Llewellyn-Bell. Hello, Richard.
Thank you. Good morning.
Another Richard from Normal, not at all. Our other Richard is taking a day off because it's his birthday soon. So we've got a chance to mix things up a bit and get you in instead. So today's subject, a bit different, but all definitely in the theme of trying to help small businesses to grow, is trying to address the challenge of recruitment that everybody's facing at the moment. And we're going to talk specifically today about recruiting ex-military personnel, military vets. And that's something that you know a little bit about.
I do. It's been a few years since I left the RAF, 22 years ago or so. I think things have evolved quite a lot in terms of transitioning, I would say. Mm-hmm. So I think we'll probably touch on some of those.
So what did you do in the RAF when you were in the service?
I was in the RAF Police, Dave. I was a RAF Police dog handler for 7 out of the 12 years. So wide and varied travel and fairly exciting stuff and fairly dull stuff from time to time.
I bet you there's loads of people listening to that thinking that sounds like an amazing job. You know, you get to be with dogs and you're traveling everywhere.
It's funny. I look back now and think it was amazing. And it was a great time in my 20s and half of my 30s or a couple of my 30s. And but then I talked to people who I know now who flew F3 fighter jets, and they like to talk to me about the RAF police dogs, which I think is amazing.
And you said earlier as
very
well,
funny,
putting us on notice a bit that we've got to make this professional, that you did actually have a bit of a stint on the radio down in the Falklands for the British.
I know, and I'm not sure I should have actually disclosed that before this podcast.
We're now
because I feel very much under pressure, but I dabbled in BFBS radio in the Falkland Islands, and I did it.
Which is the British Forces Broadcasting Service?
British Forces Broadcasting, and it's often seen as a sort of gateway into, people. John Peel, for example, I think started out.
Really?
Richard Allinson, some big names in there. And I think at the time I was thinking, well, when I get back to the UK, I might do that, but I didn't. I became a lawyer instead.
Yeah.
But,
I was going to come on to that. It does rather put into some context the fact that I used to do a bit of hospital radio in my day. I'm now feeling well and truly trumped with your BFB.
We are so pro. Yes.
So tell us a little bit then about what happened after you left the service, and you just mentioned that you became a lawyer. What was that journey like? What was that transition like?
It was a long journey, but I spent 5 years before I left after 12 years studying law in the RAF. So talking about the Falkland Islands, taking my law books down to the South Atlantic.
With a view to what you would do afterwards?
Yeah, I'd made my decision it took a long time. I literally bought a book that was an A to Z of careers. And I remember now sitting with my now wife.
What, and you opened it a random page?
Literally flicking through a book.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know. And I think there was certainly support out there. But I remember everybody left to become a Microsoft engineer. It was that was a big thing. That's all the resettlement magazines I remember lying around was all about becoming a techie engineer. Just not my cup of tea, just not very technical. And so I was literally flicking through a book. But then my friend took an A-level law. I then did.
All while you're still in the service?
When I'm in the RAF.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Like most students do enjoy studying law, especially the criminal bits. Really quite juicy stuff.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it. And I wanted a career. I didn't want to join another uniform service, if you like. And that was another obvious one for military.
Yeah.
So I wasn't doing the obvious, and I wanted a career because I was leaving at the age of 30, say, 31. And so long time working after the forces.
And did you go straight into an employment position?
I spent a year in full-time education after I left. I then I did various vocational schemes. Rag & Co in Birmingham was one that I was particularly proud of because I was a very unusual case. RAF Police Dog Handler in a medium-sized regional law firm. And that was massive, real good, something for the CV. And then I ended up in a law firm in Oswestry in the civil litigation department as basically like a paralegal. Until I had spent another 4 or 5 years in qualifying employment. So it took 2007. I started in 1999, qualified in 2007. So it was a long journey. But for many of those years, I was supervised but practicing.
Yeah, you're from doing the job.
Yeah. So
and now you're not working for someone else; you're working for yourself.
I work for myself, and we employ 2 employment lawyers. So there's a team of 3 of us looking after businesses up and down the country with retained employment law services.
That's your
amongst other things.
Yeah, rather than being general practice law firm, focus on employment law.
Just employment.
And from the position of the employer rather than employee.
Yes.
That's your thing.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, great intro. Thank you very much for that, Richard. Let me back up a little bit then and sort of give a bit of context for our listeners as to why this general recruitment problem is an issue for us all. There's 1.1 million vacancies still. I checked the stats last night. Actually went up a little bit over the last few months, but now it's just come down a little, but still 1.1 million vacancies in the UK, which is the highest it's been, as a result of a number of things. And as regular listeners of the podcast will know, there's 2 or 3 major components to what's caused that problem. We will mention Brexit, and everybody's got their own version of whether that's good or bad and ups and downs. But one of the impacts of it is that a number of people, maybe they left for other reasons, such as the pandemic, but haven't come back in again because the rules that the UK government has on bringing national citizens from other countries into the UK to work are now harder. That's the whole points-based system. So that's caused us a bit of a problem. We have another problem of early retirees and people of working age but with long-term ill health. And we've got a lot more people retiring in their 50s now or just becoming economically inactive, partly because the pandemic seems to have changed people's views about their attitude to work and maybe reevaluated whether they need to work anymore. Could they just have a more modest lifestyle and not be, maybe just go and take a part-time job somewhere and not do the same. So we've lost about 500,600,000 workers because of that. And the other one, which surprises people who've not heard of it, is that the demographic dip 20-some years ago is now coming into the workforce. So the birth rate between the late 90s and the early 2000s dropped significantly. And we're 1.8 million 18 to 25-year-olds short in the UK. They don't exist. They were never born.
I didn't know that.
Compared to other age groups. And it recovered afterwards, but it means that cohort now between 18 and 25 now, as a result of the low birth rate back then, they're now coming into the workforce.
Yes.
The rest of them are, but there aren't as many of them as there should be. So take all of that into the round and note that whether or not we do go into a recession, and we know we've got low growth and high inflation, but we don't seem to be experiencing anything on the unemployment front as a result of it. This could be the first recession in living memory, if not ever, where we don't have an increase in unemployment.
Yes.
We have full employment and a load of vacancies and a recession at the same time. So we've got this problem, and companies are still trying to grow. A number of our clients are doing very well and looking to recruit and struggling. And so we thought, well, what other angles are there as well as the usual? And hence why when you and I were talking about potentially having you as a guest on our podcast, this subject came up as really quite relevant.
Yes.
So let's have a quick sort of summary then of what we know about the numbers on military vets. Do we know how many there are and how many are coming into the workforce every year?
It seems to me there's approximately 14 to 15,000 exiting military vets.
And that's every year?
Every year.
So that's quite a pool of labour.
That's a good pool
to be tapped into.
From a community of, people with, vast skills, experience that's perhaps not tapped into as it could perhaps be.
Now, most of those do get jobs. I looked at a stat that said about 90% of military vets are in work 6 months after they leave. So there's certainly work out there. That may not necessarily be the work they want. That may just be a job, tied them over until they get what they want. So there's a big flux of new people who are, rather unlike graduates coming out with no experience and some very focused training, military vets are coming out with very detailed training and experience, different end of it all.
Yeah.
So it's a different pool to recruit from. Why do you think they're a special case then? Why should SME business owners and recruiters be thinking about military vets as a special thing to go after rather than just putting their normal adverts up and seeing who applies?
I mean, I think there's this, I think perhaps they may be misunderstood, the community, probably dating back to days gone by where the stereotypical, ex-serviceman marches in through the door and tells everyone to do some press-ups and all that kind of stuff. The military's, moved on. It's such an advanced and sort of technical organisation. There are those quite obvious skills that people could bring. And I know that large corporations already have incentives in place, but it's a bit, as I see it, a bit sort of like corporate governance. It trickles down, or it ought to trickle down to SMEs to use that same incentive. And because of one reason or another, in smaller businesses, maybe not focused on their recruitment as larger organisations.
Well, that's certainly my experience from the clients that we know who are predominantly SMEs. I see recruitment of vets being talked about on websites of much larger firms. And of those companies that we deal with in the SME sector, of course, they do recruit military vets, but more just as the course of normal recruitment. They're part of the population that apply for jobs just like anybody else. And so it's been interesting talking to some of them for their reflections on the differences, the pros and the cons, which we're going to come on to. But I don't see many SMEs promoting it, and we're going to come on later to some of the schemes around for that, or including it necessarily in their adverts to say that they're particularly positive about recruiting vets. So I think that's what today's podcast is a little bit about, just exploring whether there's merit in doing that or not, and maybe changing some views.
Yeah, and specifically targeting.
So let's go through from your experience then on what are the pros of recruiting an ex-military person, someone from the services, rather than just someone from Civvy Street that already has experience.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that businesses might see an ex-military person who lacks experience in the business world, which may be the case in terms of you're specifically that, but they have huge experience generally in things like leadership, and resilience, and coping under pressure, dealing with with a variety of different sort of situations, adaptable, variable skills like communication, organizational skills. I mean, they've just been they're built into their DNA, and often overlooked. And some of the military, I mean, from my experience, I know that a lot of the military processes have been adapted in Civvy Street, in organisations. I think years ago, I went through a selection process at Cranwell, RAF Cranwell, and interviewed by panel, and it was the most thorough and well organised process. And I very rarely hear about, certainly maybe the large organizations maybe more structured that way, but it was a good experience. I know that a lot of smaller businesses have taken that on board, so there's lots of stuff that military veterans can take into SMEs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was asking around some of the clients we have for their experiences of recruiting ex-military people, and the one about resilience came up more than the maybe more obvious one about leadership and team working, which maybe everyone expects. And it was more the fact that someone from the military is less likely, in their view, and I'm just quoting what they said here, less likely to be fazed by a deadline which requires going the extra mile, putting the extra hours in, suffering some higher stress levels at a manageable level. We're not talking about overstressing here, but that harder work period, having to put an extra shift in. But they talked, and of course they'll be recruiting other people as well that also put an extra shift in. This isn't trying to paint a black and white distinction.
No.
But they say that they've never had problems with their ex-military people, realizing that when there's a mission to be accomplished and a deadline, they'll apply themselves to that task for the sake of achieving it, A
work ethic. That's, I think...
Yes, that's true.
A pro... in the pro box, that would be the work ethic you would expect from somebody coming from a military background.
Yeah.
Because of course, there is no time to have people in the military who are not part of that team, part of that work,
part of the training,
of course, it's
the culture.
It goes with the job,
And it goes without saying that there are lots of very specific skills that people will pick up in the military, which may well be applicable. Everything from logistics, engineering, medicine, whatever it may be. There's lots of those sorts of things that could well be valuable when you come into a company.
Yeah, engineering. Yeah. There's specific trades that you are, getting, high-end training right from the start in your military career. Logistics.
Yeah.
Operational skills. It's wide and varied, isn't it?
Yeah.
Quite. When you talk about it, quite obvious. And then why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you tap into that community?
I'm thinking then, listeners to this who are looking to recruit anyway, and business owners and so on, will probably not be too surprised by what we've just talked about. I think that's probably taken as read that military people come with those pros, if you like, the team working, the leadership, the resilience, the structure, their specific skills that they bring, their aptitude for hard work, training and structure. So maybe we're reinforcing a belief there. The bit that I'd like to explore a bit more now is talking about the cons, the potential cons and the actual cons, both the myth and the reality of taking on people from a military background. Because this isn't just a big advert for saying all military people are perfect.
No.
That's the way we should go. There are pros and cons. So how do you think that plays out then? When you take on an ex-military person, what do you think is the biggest concern that employers should be aware of?
I think I've given this a bit of thought, and I would think that the different hierarchical structure in a business than the military could well be a potential for it being a struggle for both parties. You think about it. Even if you haven't served in the military, we all know how the military is sort of structured, managed, and it has to be, of course, because that's its role. And then imagine going into a small, medium-sized business, having spent 20 years with a very, very clear structure, reporting line, chain of command, and a business that wouldn't have that chain of command necessarily. Very relaxed, liberal, sort of inviting, insubordination, if you like, even to a point, creativity.
Insubordination, it sounds like an entirely negative thing. And I know what you mean. I think what you're trying to say is you don't always follow orders to the letter without question. In Civvy Street, there is space to be able to ask why and challenge and maybe do something a different way.
Yeah, and it's actually, I actually don't like that word. I use it. It's a very military word, actually. But in my job as an employment lawyer, I really cringe when businesses say, "Well, what's the allegation?" Well, he was he was insubordinate to his manager, and it takes me back to the military.
Yeah,
you know?
It's borrowing a word.
Maybe describe it as something else, but yeah, I mean that. You know, you're inviting somebody to challenge, let's say.
Yeah.
Whereas in the military, there will be times to challenge. Of course, there will be. But in your traditional sort of chain of command, you get on with stuff.
So similarly, I picked up on that in asking around the clients again about what do they see as some of the cons, and they put one of them in particular put an experience that they'd had with a recent employee, more in the context of from their point of view, the employee's point of view, that they struggled with the fact that people around them didn't just do what they were told without question. And they thought that was really odd. You know, how can you run an organization where the manager has asked for certain things to be done and then not everybody does it? And why are there not consequences? And that sort of thing. So that was more of a struggle for them just to over the concept of come to terms with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's obviously the lack of experience in businesses in general, commercial decision making. You know, that's quite an obvious one. But remember, the military since my day has changed. So I'm sort of not qualified to talk about that recent, but I know because a number of my friends are more recent leavers, that there are areas where you're encouraged to challenge, especially at more senior management levels in the military. Of course there are. But the further down the line you go, it's just like, say for example, a factory setting. You know, you have to have people who simply just do as they are asked to do by their line manager. But the more senior you get, board of directors, of course you're not going to. The whole point is that you sit around and challenge one another. Yeah. So to a large extent, especially now in the modern military, there might not be much of a difference. You know, and I think
we have to distinguish a little bit here between the military is such a broad organisation with lots of different roles.
Yes.
If you're recruiting someone to be an operator or a supervisor on the shop floor, then the idea of being able to follow instructions and having a reasonably structured hierarchy and reporting lines is a good thing, and may well be closer in your manufacturing organisation to that expectation anyway. Yeah. Whereas the support arms people from behind the scenes, you know, whether it be logistics and medicine or up the chain of command, then they're more likely, as you're describing there, to operate in a very similar fashion anyway. It's about decision making, brainstorming, challenging one another,
disrupting. Yeah. So I think those are when we talk it through, think about it, that there's a whole community out there that there actually might not be that much different. Yeah. For your potential.
What about that sort of sense of camaraderie and banter that I can only imagine being a layman, that when you're in the military, you have a very strong bond with people. You're away from home, you're being looked after, you've got all of your needs from your housing and your food quite often being looked after for you as well. And you've got that sort of way of joking with one another. There's the language you use, the acronyms and all the abbreviations and everything. And that way of, you know, just bonding as a team, maybe even encouraged, maybe with some alcohol and you know, in the officers' mess and all that. No, it never happens, I'm sure. When someone goes into the workplace, there's a divorce there between, you may get up to all that sort of stuff with your mates, but that's not what you go to work for necessarily. So do you think that's something that military people, you know, have to be aware of, or employers have to be aware of in making that adjustment? Yeah,
I think without doubt that's the military sense of humour is well known. And I mean, even 22 years later, when I'm in amongst ex-military friends, it's quite a bizarre situation. If anybody was listening to us, it would be ridiculous. But there's civilians who have never served in the military in that same pool. For example, I'm thinking of a cycling trip up in Scotland a couple of years ago, and I loved it. It was fabulous to be back in that sharp, witty, pretty sailing close to the wind on a couple of things. But you put that in the context of workplace, it can be a challenge.
Well, and I'm not saying it's especially the case now. It should always have been thus. But I think our awareness these days of being very inclusive, a diverse organisation, and being very aware not to cause any environment within work that might exclude people or make them feel uncomfortable. You know, we're going out of our way now as employers to be very sensitive to all sorts of issues, where the sort of culture you just talked about would be absolutely at odds with that. So that must take a little bit of adaptation.
It does, but if you're talking about intelligent people who are able to adapt, you judge your audience. There's no difference. I mean, I'm thinking a situation, if I was in the military still, my conversation with some friends in the bar, clearly I'm smart enough to be able to, when I'm then mixing with members of the public in a some sort of ceremony or something like that, you adjust and adapt.
Yeah,
but I think that's a skill. I mean, one of my strengths, I think, was that I could actually mix with all sorts of different people.
Yeah.
So if you turn that on its head, that's fantastic. I think that's a great skill. You clearly behave yourself at work.
Yeah.
That's a control mechanism. That's what we, No,
I don't think that, from what you're saying, and it makes absolute sense, any of the cons that people or employers might perceive are in large part down to the adjustments anyway that the ex-military person will be making naturally anyway. And as you say, they're well suited to do that. But there's nothing really in there which is a showstopper. All of those things just have to be taken into account, that they're a transition, maybe getting used to the less strict command and control structure perhaps, and the lines of reporting and the how people respond to orders and the banter and all that. That would probably happen reasonably naturally anyway. Probably not much different to taking on a graduate who hasn't been used to the workplace either. They have to learn that where they've come from, that behaviour isn't always
we do things
transferable to the workplace.
And or even just another business who operates maybe slightly stricter in a different way, or more liberally.
And I think that's true. It's a good point. If you go from SME to large corporate or vice versa, you notice quite a difference. SMEs can often be a lot more jovial and bantery, but suddenly you go into the large corporate and you've got the threat of HR coming down on you like a ton of bricks if you make jokes of a certain type. So I think it's not a preserve of military versus civil street. It's culture generally. Different places.
And I think just talking about going back to the sort of behavioural stuff and the banter, but that's down to businesses reasonably managing that and managing it sensibly. I mean, there's behaviours that go on that are not the behaviours of military vets. You don't need to be a military veteran to conduct yourself in a particular way that's not acceptable. I mean, that goes on all the time. So employers have that on duty in any event to manage their people sort of sensibly.
Well, I think it's a good roundup then, and we covered, I think, trying to be honest there on both sides really. There's an awful lot of pros from taking on someone with that sort of life experience and the training they've had and the culture of team working and leadership and achieving missions. And we're just trying to be honest that it's not all roses and that there are adjustments to be made. Once the adjustment has been made, you've got yourself a very valuable employee.
Indeed.
So what do you think then in terms of practical steps that employers can take if they're looking to not just accept all applicants and some of whom may be military vets, but to target it, or what could they do practically to put their name out there?
I mean, I would go, you and I have talked about the Armed Forces Covenant, which is it's got some traction now with many businesses who.
What do you know about that? Let's tell our listeners.
I mean, it's an undertaking. It's not legally binding. It's an undertaking, a desire by a business to actively seek, and support military vet communities.
Right.
And obviously, in that sense, they would be looking at the military veterans to recruit them into jobs and help them transition.
Are there sort of requirements you have to meet to sort of pass and be awarded the covenant, or is it just a pledge almost?
Yeah, it's a pledge. It's not necessarily an onerous task. But the information's online. Armed Forces Covenant. There's lots of information about that. But you're right. The good word is pledge. And it's a recognition really.
You can use that phrase and maybe
you can use the covenant on your websites and your letterheads, and
there must be a directory of those companies that are signed up.
Yeah,
that covenant. So that's one way of doing it. And I guess even as simple in your job adverts, pointing out that you are particularly welcoming applicants from a military background, that you understand that some of the transitions will be different from someone coming from a different background, and that you're ready for that.
Yeah.
That you're welcoming it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe the onboarding will be slightly tailored accordingly, and you can point that out.
Well, you can focus. I mean, there are some organisations. I'm thinking some of the professional services like PwC and Barclays Bank actively do this, or they do this already. They guarantee interviews for military veterans, and there are some who specifically target military veterans into roles. The latter being could be controversial, in terms of fair selection.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's certainly something that
it's an interesting device thing that I had not thought of before. The idea of guaranteeing an interview. You're certainly not guaranteeing anybody a job, but you're saying that maybe your CV isn't presented conventionally the way we're reading them, or the way you're presenting yourself in your cover letter. So take that out, take that risk of not coming across well out of the equation, and say, as long as you've applied, you'll at least get a chance to come sit to us.
Sit in front of you. Yeah. And I don't know about you, Dave, but you're involved in a lot of recruitment, I know. And CVs are quite clearly brilliant, aren't they? When people tell you how
they've been well polished.
Of course they are. They're not going to do anything other than
Well, you'd be surprised how many we see that aren't.
Well,
on the whole,
on the whole,
yes,
it's an opportunity to tell people how brilliant you are.
Yeah.
But I always like to get under the skin and meet the person. So you're quite right. If there is although there is, a lot of resettlement support for the military leavers in their CV in preparation for transitioning out. So you'd like to think that isn't such a problem. But if it was, a guaranteed interview.
That's a nice idea, a guaranteed interview if you want to go down that route.
Yeah.
Now, you also mentioned earlier something about the Career Transfer Partnership. So what do you know about that? What's that?
So that's an MOD government initiative that helps, that partners with Right Marketing, which is a global placement business.
Right.
And so that's CTP is sort of where I would signpost, I suppose,
right,
any businesses, any listeners who are looking at into this further.
So they get access then to a recruitment placement.
So they service. It's a platform to search for military veterans.
And you can put your own jobs on there?
Put your own jobs in there, register.
Am I right in thinking that that's free? It's a free service?
Yeah, I believe it is. And there's details online. Career Transition Partnership.
CTP.org.uk, I think, was the website we looked up earlier.
I mean, it's there. There's a section where you click on for employers, and it tells you all about it.
Yeah. All right, well, that's very interesting. Okay, so it's been a good few sort of practical tips there as well. If anybody's looking to tap into 14,000
every year
potential employees coming out every year, and it's a machine that's producing that on a regular basis, highly trained people.
Yeah.
Maybe look at either the Career Transition Partnership, ctp.org.uk, or consider the Covenant and making it clear in your own advertising and recruitment processes, maybe even with a guaranteed interview type approach to welcome people with a military background in and acknowledge that they bring an enhanced level of skills from what you might get in other applicant courses.
Yeah, recognise that and create ultimately what would be a diverse workforce, or perhaps a more diverse workforce.
Yeah, quite interesting. Yeah. Well, I hope that's been useful to our listeners today who are running SME businesses and trying to recruit in these difficult times with so many vacancies out there in the market. So thanks again for listening. This has been the SME Growth Podcast, focusing on challenging the recruitment difficulties with potentially a different approach to looking at ex-military personnel. As I ask every week when you listen, please comment on and share and like our podcasts, depending on wherever you get them from. But more importantly, tell anybody you know that's also in business that you think might be interested in the sort of content we're producing, and tell them to listen and maybe give them a chance to pick up on what we're talking about as well. So in the meantime, good luck with your businesses.